I was born near Stone Ridge, the kind of place you learn to avoid even when you barely understand why. Folks in town call it bad ground, but no one ever says it loud enough for an outsider to hear. I grew up hearing hushed warnings at the general store, whispered between the men sipping black coffee, or from women at the church basement bake sales, glancing over their shoulders when they mentioned it. My parents never had much to say except that you stay on the marked paths and you don't wander off when the fog rolls down the slopes. I didn't think much of it back then. I was 17, dumb enough to believe the stories were just old mountain superstition, the kind of nonsense you shake your head at and laugh off with a cousin daring you to prove you're braver than your elders. Caleb and I were inseparable at that age, always looking for a thrill, a shortcut, a place the grown-ups said not to go. It was late October when we set out for the ridge. The air was damp and the fog had started to settle thick over the valley. I remember the way the leaves stuck to my boots, the smell of wet pine needles pressing into my nose. We laughed, shoved each other, pretending like nothing was wrong, but the further we walked, the heavier the silence became. The woods seemed too still, almost as if the trees themselves were watching us pass. I told myself it was just the fog, just my imagination. Caleb joked that maybe the ridge didn't want us there. I laughed along with him, but inside a small knot of unease had formed in my stomach. About 2 hours into the hike, we realized the footsteps began. At first we didn't pay attention, thinking it was just the branches snapping under our own weight, the echo bouncing oddly on the ridge's steep walls. But soon it became unmistakable, a heavy, deliberate step always behind us. Not matching our pace exactly, but in a rhythm that suggested something was following, waiting for a moment when we'd let our guard down. We froze. I stopped mid-step. The sound stopped behind us. Caleb nudged me to keep moving, and the steps resumed, synchronized with our motion. Neither of us spoke. We didn't look back. My heart hammered, not with fear of what it might be, but with a growing understanding that the ridge was watching us, assessing us, and that we were trespassing in a place that didn't want visitors. I remember gripping my backpack straps until my knuckles were white. Every now and then, a branch would break in the distance, but we didn't dare turn our heads. The fog closed in around us, thick and cold, pressing against our ears so that the only sound was our own breathing and the rhythm of those phantom footsteps. When we reached the halfway ledge, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the carvings. I can still see them in my mind. A line of names etched into the weathered rock face, 14 of them, teenagers just like us, all vanished from the county records between 1957 and 2001. The letters were unnervingly sharp, fresh as if someone had taken a carbide tool to the rock yesterday. Moss hadn't even begun to claim them. My breath caught in my throat. Caleb leaned close, whispering my name, and I shook my head. We didn't speak, didn't even exhale loudly. The ridge had revealed a secret it had been keeping for decades, a ledger of disappearances that no one dared discuss aloud. We stared, frozen, as the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent that reminded me of wet iron. The silence pressed in, dense and suffocating. The footsteps behind us had paused at the ledge, and for a long moment I thought maybe whatever it was had stopped, turned back, or was watching from a distance. Then, without warning, a long, slow exhale rolled down the ridge, carrying a satisfaction that made my stomach turn. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't wind, not exactly. It sounded like deliberate, measured relief, like a predator had confirmed its territory. My legs went rigid, Caleb grabbing my arm. We had no choice but to descend as fast as we could, though the ridge seemed to stretch on endlessly. The path down was worse than the climb. Every step felt slower, every branch seemed ready to trip us. My lungs burned from the cold air, my chest tightened as if the ridge itself was pressing against me, testing my endurance. Behind us the fog thickened again, swallowing any shape, any sound, anything that might have been following. I kept hearing the echo of that exhale in my head, the whispered satisfaction of a presence we had neither seen nor wanted to acknowledge. It chased us silently just beyond the veil of fog. A reminder that some places have memory and will mark the trespassers in ways you cannot see. We made it to the bottom, collapsing onto the wet grass at the edge of the forest. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, only listening to the distant rush of a creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. Caleb was pale, shaking, staring at the ridge as if it might rise and swallow him whole. I felt the same, a strange trembling that wasn't just from the chill. I had seen something there, or maybe understood the weight of the ridge itself, something older and colder than any person could be. We promised each other we'd never speak of it, and we kept that promise. Caleb hasn't hiked since. I haven't either. Even now, years later, I can feel the ridge calling. I hear the stories of kids disappearing, the whispered warnings from older locals who never let outsiders near the trailheads. And when the wind shifts, carrying the smell of wet pine and iron, I can almost hear the slow, deliberate steps behind me, matching my own pace, waiting for me to falter. Sometimes I wonder if anyone who walks Stone Ridge ever truly leaves it behind. The names on that ledge, 14 teenagers carved into stone, remain as sharp and fresh in my memory as they were that foggy night. I think the ridge remembers. I think it has always remembered. And I think anyone who walks its paths is leaving a mark that will never be erased, whether they vanish or return, whether they tell anyone or stay silent. I can close my eyes and see it all, the fog, the weight of the footsteps, the carved names, the exhale that followed us down the slope. Every detail remains etched in me. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind against the rocks carries that memory. And I know that when someone dares walk Stone Ridge again, it will be waiting. Patient, observant, judging. Even in the quiet of my home, far from the ridge, I can feel it sometimes. In the early hours before dawn, when the fog rolls over the hills in our valley, a chill passes through the room and I hear it. A slow exhale, satisfied, deliberate. I tell myself it's just imagination, the mind playing tricks after years of stories and memories, but I know better. I remember what we saw, what we felt, what the ridge allowed us to witness, and what it never allowed us to understand. Some things are meant to be remembered, some things meant to be feared in silence. Stone Ridge is one of those things. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can see the names carved sharp into the stone, and I can hear the steps echoing behind me, as if the ridge itself had learned to follow, to track, to remember every visitor who dared to walk where they weren't wanted. And I understand that this is not a story I can tell the world, only one I can hold inside as a warning to anyone foolish enough to think they understand these mountains. Because some places, no matter how familiar they seem, hold secrets older than any of us, and Stone Ridge is one of them. I remember that night clearer than most, clearer than the day I was born sometimes. Cold Spring Gap had always been a place people in our county avoided once the sun dipped below the ridges. I'd grown up hearing tales about it, stories whispered in the back of the general store, or at church socials, about hunters who vanished, hikers who never returned, dogs that refused to cross the low stone bridge near the mouth of the gap. At 17, though, I thought I knew better. I thought I could handle it. The sun was already low, a slanting orange light barely reaching the narrow corridor of trees that framed the gap. I was hunting small game with my father's old rifle, the one with the worn stock and a scratch along the barrel from some long-forgotten accident. I liked the quiet, liked the way the mist began to roll in along the ground, muffling the sound of my footsteps and making the forest feel like it existed in its own world, separate from ours. I followed a rabbit trail deeper into the gap than I ever had before. The trees pressed close, their trunks slick with damp and moss. Every step seemed to echo faintly, bouncing off the ridges in a way that made me glance behind me more than once. I could feel the mist clinging to my sleeves and hair, chilling me despite the movement of my arms and legs. That's when I saw the lights. At first I thought they were reflections of my own flashlight on wet leaves, but then I realized they were separate, swinging gently between the trees, like lanterns carried by someone I couldn't see. My chest tightened, not just with fear, but with that peculiar sense of being watched, the one you feel before you ever hear a sound. No one called out. No dogs barked. Nothing moved except those lights, shifting as if they were circling me, drifting closer, then farther, but never too close to reveal their source. I ducked behind a tree, pressing my back into the damp bark, trying to slow my breathing so they wouldn't hear it. My heart was hammering in my ears. I stayed that way for what felt like minutes, the fog pressing against me, the smell of wet pine and earth filling my nose. Then the lights froze. They hung in the mist like suspended fireflies, unmoving. My stomach churned as I realized the feeling I had wasn't just fear. It was recognition, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. Slowly, all the lights blinked out at once, as if someone had reached up and snuffed them with a single hand. The gap plunged into near darkness, the mist thick enough that I could barely see my own hands. Panic rose in my chest. I ran. I didn't know where I was going at first, only that I needed to put distance between myself and whatever had been watching. The wind whipped around me, carrying a faint whisper that made my blood run cold. I swear it said my name, though I didn't stop to listen closely. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept running until the edge of the woods met the dirt road leading back to town. Only when I reached the familiar curve of the road did I allow myself to slow, my hands shaking as I leaned against a tree to catch my breath. Morning came in a haze. I went back with my father, hoping to find some evidence of the night's strange encounter. Footprints in the mud, perhaps, or a campsite. Something that would explain the lights, the whisper, the way the gap had pressed against me like it had its own heartbeat. But there was nothing. No sign anyone had been there. The ground was undisturbed, the leaves not even crushed in the pattern of a person walking. It was as if the night had swallowed itself and spat nothing out. My father frowned and muttered that the gap always swallowed everything in silence, that it had been like that long before either of us were born. He told me to remember that some places don't like to be disturbed, that they have their own way of preserving secrets, even years later. Long after I'd left home and walked countless forests and mountains, Cold Spring Gap lingers in my memory. I can picture the narrow corridor of trees, the way the mist curls around the trunks and coils across the floor of the gap like it's alive. On certain nights when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear whispers again, soft and fleeting, calling my name. No one else ever hears them. People laugh when I mention the lights, the way they circled me, the exhaled breath that seemed to drift along with the fog. They say it's imagination, a boy's nerves, the way your mind can play tricks when it's alone in the dark. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It wasn't just the lights. It was the way the forest responded, how it seemed to know I was there. I remember glancing up at the ridges above the gap, noticing that the treetops swayed slightly even without wind, as if something up there was aware of me. Every snapping twig, every distant rustle of leaves felt deliberate, timed, measured, and the whisper, that faint, fleeting sound carrying my name, it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like recognition, a reminder that the gap had noticed me, cataloged me, and was keeping a record of my intrusion. When I tell people about it now, I leave out details, though they linger in my mind vividly. The rhythm of the lights moving through the trees, the sudden blink of darkness, the suffocating mist pressing against my body, the sensation that the forest itself was holding its breath. The memory is so precise that sometimes I feel it physically, a tightness in my chest and stomach, even years later. I try to reason it away, to convince myself that it was just fog, lantern reflections, maybe even a prank by older kids. But I know that the gap doesn't behave like that without reason. And I know that those who wander too far sometimes never return. There's a lesson buried in that memory, one I still think about when the wind rattles my windows in late autumn, when the fog creeps low across the hills and valleys near my home. Cold Spring Gap doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. It watches. And though I escaped that night, the memory itself has never let me go. The ridge, the gap, the trees pressed together in unnatural tightness, they all speak to something older than us, something patient and deliberate. Sometimes I imagine the lights moving again in the trees, circling an empty space waiting for someone to disturb the quiet. Even now, when I walk forest trails in other counties, I find myself scanning the mist, watching for movement that isn't mine, hearing faint whispers that vanish when I turn to look. I catch my breath and shake my head, telling myself it's just nerves. But part of me knows differently. The gap taught me that some things cannot be rationalized, that some places have their own memory, their own awareness. That night remains vivid because it matters, because the forest remembered my presence long after I thought I had left it behind. And in remembering, I understand something I hadn't before. There are places you visit not just physically, but spiritually, places that mark you in ways you cannot escape, that whisper to you years later, reminding you that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. Cold Spring Gap will never forgive me, but it also never needed to. It only needed to remind me, and it has. And even now, years later, I can feel it pressing through the memory, The mist, the trees, the unseen lights flickering silently between the trunks, circling and blinking out, leaving nothing but quiet and the memory of a boy who wandered too far. The fear, the wonder, and the subtle awareness of being watched has never left me. It is part of me now, as much a part as the hills I was raised among, the creeks I grew up fishing in, and the mountains that cradle the valley where I first learned to know that silence can be heavier than any sound, and that sometimes the forest itself is alive in ways you cannot see, measure, or outrun. I had been hiking all afternoon, the sun long gone behind the ridges, leaving the forest wrapped in the kind of twilight that turns shadows into shapes and makes every branch a possible hand reaching for you. Hollow Creek Bridge came into view just as the fog began rolling down the valley, curling along the ground and clinging to the trunks of the pines. It was narrow, rickety, and known among locals as a place to avoid once darkness falls. I had no choice but to cross it. The back trail I had taken was supposed to be a shortcut to the road that led to my home, and by the time I reached the creek, I was tired, my legs aching from the climb and the weight of my pack. The bridge swayed faintly under my feet, each creak echoing into the foggy valley like a warning I wasn't ready to heed. The planks were slick with moss and damp from the evening mist, and I gripped the thin rope handrail with both hands, trying to steady myself. That's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate step behind me. My stomach dropped. I froze, the sound stopping instantly as if whatever was there knew exactly when I paused. I turned my flashlight toward the darkness behind me, the beam cutting a narrow path through the thickening fog, illuminating nothing but the trees and the creeping mist. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. Each step I took was mirrored in rhythm behind me, matching my pace so precisely it made my skin crawl. My heart raced not from exertion, but from the knowledge that something or someone was walking with me, unseen but exact in timing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. They didn't shift or scuff like a creature moving blindly. They followed my every movement, stopping when I stopped, quickening when I ran. I remember gripping the rope tighter, my knuckles white, my breath short and ragged. The fog seemed to close in tighter around the bridge, pressing against my ears, muting the usual sounds of the creek below. Every plank beneath my boots creaked in protest, but I dared not look down. I dared not look back. I just moved forward, step by step, the echo of footsteps behind me a constant drum against my nerves. Halfway across, I lost control of my thoughts entirely. Panic welled in my chest, a heavy burning thing that made my head spin. I wanted to sprint, but my legs felt like lead. I imagined myself stumbling and falling into the dark waters below, and the idea of something unseen behind me, perfectly in step, made my mind twist further into fear. I remember my flashlight flickering, the beam shaking in my hands, cutting through the fog in irregular bursts. I felt the fog itself pressing in, and for the first time in my life, I realized the forest had its own awareness. It wasn't alive in the sense we understand, but it watched, it measured, it judged. The steps behind me were not just noise, they were attention. Deliberate, patient, waiting for me to falter. I ran then, faster than I thought humanly possible across the slick planks, my pack bouncing against my back, heart hammering against my ribs. And still the steps followed, stopping when I stopped, quickening when I ran. The rope handrail scraped against my palms as I stumbled, nearly throwing me off balance, but I stayed upright, my eyes straining through the fog, trying to make out any shape, any movement. Nothing, only the fog, only the shadows, only the cold pressing against my skin like a weight. I could hear the creek below, louder now, a relentless rush of water, a reminder of the drop I might meet if I faltered. I barely made it across, collapsing on the opposite bank, my chest heaving, sweat mixing with the damp mist. The steps had vanished, or perhaps I had escaped their rhythm. My flashlight drooped in my trembling hands, and I stayed there for minutes, listening to nothing, waiting for the echo to return, but the forest was silent. The fog swirled around me, thick and chilling, and the creek continued its relentless rush. I didn't look back, didn't speak. I just crawled to the dirt path leading toward home, each step slow and cautious, my mind trying to understand what had happened. Later, when I told a friend about it, he didn't laugh, didn't try to dismiss it as imagination. He only nodded, grim, and told me about the history of Hollow Creek Bridge. In 1968, a group of teenagers had gone missing there. No bodies, no trace, no reason. People whispered about strange footsteps, lights in the fog, the way the creek itself seemed to swallow sound and memory. Some nights, he said, they still crossed the bridge, unseen, keeping step with anyone unlucky enough to walk there. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The story itself, tied to the place, was enough to make the hairs on my neck stand on end. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the bridge in that fog, feel the slick planks under my boots, hear the echo of steps that should not have been. I can remember the rhythm, the perfect timing, the way the mist clung to every tree, every branch, pressing in around me until I thought I might vanish along with the creek's sound. I can feel it still. A lingering awareness that someone or something is keeping pace just beyond the edge of perception, patient and deliberate. I try to reason it, to tell myself it was a shadow, the rhythm of an animal, my own imagination magnified by fatigue and fear. But I know the truth. I know the bridge has memory. I know it waits. The forest does not forget, the creek does not forgive, and the bridge itself has seen more than anyone will ever speak aloud. I remember the panic, the cold pressing on my skin, the desperate flight across planks that might have buckled beneath me, and the uncanny echo of those heavy steps always just behind, always in time. Walking the bridge at night is impossible for me now. Even driving past, the road cutting through the gap makes me grip the wheel tighter, my eyes tracing the fog and the shadows that cling to it. I know that Hollow Creek Bridge is not just a crossing, it is a marker, a silent witness to those who pass, a stage where unseen footsteps still follow, unseen eyes still watch, and the memory of those lost teenagers lingers like a warning carved into the very wood. Sometimes, I think of the fog rolling low in the valley at night, and I hear the echo again, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I remember the weight of the forest, the chilling patience of the unseen, the way the bridge swayed beneath me as if testing my resolve. I know it will never let me forget. The gap holds its secrets close, and for anyone who has crossed Hollow Creek Bridge in the dark, there is a part of it that will always follow, always observe, always wait, even now. After years and countless trails and woods walked in daylight, I feel that same rhythm in the corners of my mind when the wind whistles through the ridges. I can almost see the fog thickening, the shadows pressing closer, hear the echoing step that mimics mine exactly, reminding me that the bridge remembers, that the forest remembers, and that some nights, the lost teenagers walk with anyone foolish enough to venture near. Unseen but in perfect time, the memory haunts me, not because of what I saw, but because of what I did not see. There was nothing tangible, nothing I could point to and say, that is why I feared. Only the rhythm, the echo, the patient steps, and the quiet observation. Hollow Creek Bridge doesn't need to reveal itself to terrify. It only needs to exist. And it does in the mist in the night, in the memory of a boy who crossed too late, who heard the steps behind him, and who understands now that some places are alive in ways you cannot measure, and that some histories never truly rest. I can still feel the weight, even here in the daylight of my home far from the gap. When the wind shifts and carries a faint echo through the hills, the steps, the mist, the swaying planks, they all come back, pressing against my chest and reminding me that Hollow Creek Bridge is patient, deliberate, and exacting in its attention. It waits for no one, forgives no one, and remembers everything. And I will never cross it at night again, though the memory of that rhythm, the slow, heavy steps that matched mine perfectly, will never leave me. Devil's Hollow was a place I knew to respect long before I ever set foot there. Even as a boy, I could feel it, the way the wind twisted through the trees differently than anywhere else, carrying a weight that pressed on your chest and whispered faintly in the spaces between leaves. I had grown up hearing the older folks talk about the hollow in hushed tones, warning children not to wander too deep, to stay close to the path, to avoid the thickets where the trees grew thick and tangled. But I was 17 and alone that afternoon, tasked with gathering firewood for the cabin before nightfall. The sun was low, cutting golden streaks through the dense canopy, and I moved carefully, my axe balanced on my shoulder, scanning the ground for fallen limbs, thinking nothing of the stories. The hollow seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. The wind moved in strange, purposeful currents, swirling around my legs, tugging at my jacket, rustling the dry leaves in the underbrush in patterns that made me pause more than once. And then I heard it, whistle. At first I thought it was a bird, some lone songbird calling to its mate, but the tone was wrong. It was high-pitched, deliberate, almost mocking. It wasn't a song, not really, but a sound that carried intention. I froze, my axe held tight in my hands, listening. The whistle stopped the moment I moved closer and resumed when I stopped. My pulse quickened, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind and my nerves. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning once that sound began. Every step I took seemed measured against the rhythm of the whistle. It mocked me as if it knew I was there, aware of me, keeping track. Darkness settled quickly in Devil's Hollow, faster than in any other part of the mountain. Shadows gathered around the trunks, hiding the shapes of rocks and roots that could have sent me tumbling if I misstepped. My legs were scratched and bruised, but I could not stop, could not risk letting my attention drift. The whistle never left me, keeping pace with my heartbeat. Weaving through the branches, curling around the fog that crept low over the forest floor. I stumbled over rocks and roots more times than I can count. Each fall was met with a tense pause in the whistling, as though the sound itself was alive and waiting for me to rise again. I remember gripping my axe tighter, knuckles white, my ears straining for any other sound. The forest was otherwise silent. No birds, no animals, no human presence. The only thing I could hear was the persistent, deliberate whistle, high and haunting, carrying with it an almost palpable awareness. Finally, as the last traces of sunlight vanished, I spotted the faint glow of the cabin in the distance, lights flickering through the trees. Relief flooded me, but so did a lingering fear. I ran toward the lights, stumbling and scraping my arms against low branches. The moment I passed the tree line that marked the edge of the hollow, the whistling stopped. Silence returned, but it was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that waits, that lingers in your ears, making you certain that the sound is still there somewhere, just beyond reach, biding its time. I didn't speak of the encounter that night. I was shaken too deeply. My father later noticed my pale face and trembling hands and asked what had happened. I could only shake my head, the memory too vivid, too unnerving to form words around. He said simply, "Those trees in that hollow remember who walks there." At the time, I had thought it a figure of speech, a warning to respect the forest. But the memory never leaves. I can still hear the whistle sometimes, faint, impossible to locate, carrying with it the same deliberate, mocking tone. Years later, I walk near the hollow and the wind carries with it that memory. The way it twists and curls through the branches, the rhythm of sound against the trees, the way the darkness seems to gather faster there, pressing down on the shoulders. I understand now that Devil's Hollow is more than just a stretch of woods. It is aware in its own way, an entity of memory, of pattern, that does not forgive and does not forget. The trees remember those who wander too deep. The wind remembers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that faint whistle, not calling to me, but reminding me that I was seen, catalogued, and cannot be forgotten. Even standing safely outside the hollow, in the warmth of a cabin or the comfort of daylight, I can feel it pressing at the edges of my senses. The slightest gust of wind can carry it back, and my heartbeat recalls the rhythm it matched so precisely, a rhythm that could never be mistaken for coincidence. It was deliberate, observant, patient. The memory has stayed with me, embedding itself in my body, in my pulse, in the subtle tension I carry whenever I am alone in the woods. Devil's Hollow is patient. It does not chase. It waits, it watches, it remembers. And sometimes, when the evening fog rolls in low across the hills, I swear I hear the whistle again. Not far, not close, but somewhere in the distance, winding through the trees. It does not frighten me in the same way anymore. It reminds me. It reminds me that the forest itself holds memory, that the hollow is alive in ways I will never understand. That night changed me, more than any other experience in my youth. The forest, the wind, the sound, it all remains. A constant presence just beyond perception. A reminder that some places are not meant to be understood, only respected, only remembered, only survived, even now. If I stand still in the evening, letting the wind carry the smell of pine and earth through my lungs, I can hear it. The high-pitched whistle, faint, deliberate, almost mocking, wrapping around me like it did that night. I remember every step I took, every trip over rocks and roots, every heartbeat measured against the sound. I remember the darkness pressing in, the forest silent except for that one unnerving sound. I remember the relief at the cabin lights and the unnatural stillness that followed. And I remember my father's words echoing in my mind. Those trees remember. Some nights I think about returning, about stepping into the hollow once more to see if it still holds the same awareness, if the wind still carries the same deliberate sound. But I never do. Some things you learn are meant to be experienced only once, and some memories are meant to be carried for a lifetime. The forest, the hollow, the wind, they are patient, deliberate, and relentless in their observation. The whistling has never truly left me, and I doubt it ever will. Even now, years later, when I hear the faintest wind shift through the hills near my home, I tense, half expecting that familiar tone. Not because I fear it now in the way I did as a boy, but because I recognize its awareness, its deliberate patience. Devil's Hollow remains alive in memory, in sound, in rhythm. It waits, it watches. It remembers every person who walks beneath its trees, every step they take, every mistake they make, every heartbeat it can match with its own strange cadence. And I know I will carry that memory with me until the day I die, a subtle, constant reminder of the Hollow's presence and its refusal to ever be forgotten. I was 20 when I stumbled across the cabin on Blackwater Ridge, though stumbled might be too casual a word for it. I had been hiking alone, following a narrow trail that wound up the ridge like a ribbon of dirt through the forest, my pack heavy with supplies for a day spent exploring. The air was damp, the kind that presses against your clothes and seeps into your bones, and the smell of pine and wet earth was thick in my nose. The sun had begun to lower behind the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail and made every root and rock look larger than it should. I was tired, my legs sore but curious as I always was, drawn to the ridge by a stubborn sense that something lay hidden beyond the path, something the usual hikers never found. The cabin was tucked into a small clearing, almost hidden by the slope and trees. The door was ajar, hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. At first glance it appeared ordinary. Small, simple construction, a chimney that had long stopped smoking, and a roof sagging in places under the weight of years. But the moment I stepped closer, I noticed the smell. Faint, metallic, like iron or blood, subtle enough that it didn't hit immediately, but when it registered, my stomach tightened. My instinct screamed to leave, to turn back down the ridge and forget this place ever existed, but I didn't. I was young, stubborn, and fascinated. Inside, everything looked normal, almost too normal. A table, chairs, dishes stacked neatly on a sideboard. The room was dusted, as if someone had cleaned recently. But then I noticed the arrangement of the chairs, all facing the center of the room, as if whoever had been here had been sitting in them, watching something or someone in the middle. I felt a prickle along the back of my neck, the kind of unease that seeps into your bones, and yet I couldn't move. I sat on the floor for a long time, trying to tell myself I was imagining things, trying to convince myself that it was just an abandoned cabin with a strange layout. But the feeling of eyes on me was unmistakable, growing heavier with every tick of the fading light. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had a strange quality there, distorted by the stillness and the watchful silence. The forest outside seemed distant, the wind unable to reach the cabin, the usual sounds of birds or insects completely absent. Every small noise, the creak of a floorboard beneath my weight, the soft sigh of the wooden walls settling, felt amplified, as if the cabin itself were aware of me, counting my breaths, marking my presence. I tried to readjust my focus, to study the dishes, the furniture, the odd perfection of the room. Everything seemed as though someone could walk in at any moment, though I knew, rationally, I was alone. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge completely, the forest outside had gone unnaturally still. No breeze moved the branches, no birds stirred in the trees, no animals rustled in the underbrush. I stepped outside to stretch my legs to see the ridge in the last light of day. The air felt heavy, dense, pressing against my lungs. I tried to mark the path I had taken to the cabin with broken branches, scratches on bark, anything I could use to find my way back if I needed to. But when I glanced back, the cabin had vanished. Not just hidden by trees, but gone, as if it had never been there. I searched the clearing, circling it slowly, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But it was as if the ridge itself had swallowed the cabin. erased it from existence. Some places in these mountains are like that. Places that refuse to be remembered, that hide themselves from anyone who stumbles across them. I walked the ridge slowly, my heartbeat loud in my ears, eyes darting to every shadow and shape in the dim light. My pack felt heavier, my legs weaker. I kept glancing back, expecting to see the cabin reappear, or at least the door hanging open. But there was nothing. Just forest, just the narrowing trail, just the quiet that seemed unnatural in its perfection. I remember the smell again, faint but lingering, metallic and sharp, pressing at the back of my throat. It followed me down the trail, mingling with the scent of damp earth and pine. I wondered if it was a memory of the cabin itself, imprinted on the ridge, a warning for those who came too close, those who watched too long. By the time I reached the bottom of the ridge where the path met the main road, the feeling of being watched had not left me. It lingered in my chest, a tight knot that refused to unwind. I didn't speak of it to anyone for weeks, not wanting to sound foolish or unbalanced. Even now, years later, I can recall every detail. The way the light shifted through the windows, the precise arrangement of the chairs, the metallic smell that clung to the air. I remember the unnatural stillness of the forest outside, the way it felt as if the ridge itself were holding its breath, waiting, judging. Some nights, when I lie awake in my home far from Blackwater Ridge, I can still feel that presence, subtle and patient, as though the memory of that cabin is alive somewhere, watching, waiting for another visitor who might notice the small details, the whispers of awareness hidden in the wood. In the wind, in the quiet, I returned once. Years later, driven by curiosity I can hardly explain. The ridge was familiar, the trail marked in my memory, but the cabin was never there again. Not in that clearing, not on any of the surrounding slopes. I searched for hours, climbing the ridge and combing every hollow, every patch of clearing I could find, but it was gone. I realized then that some places are not meant to be seen more than once. That memory alone can carry the weight of experience. That the forest has its own way of hiding what it does not want to reveal. I carry the memory with me like a scar. I remember the smell, the way the chairs faced the center, the quiet, the sense of being observed without seeing anyone. I remember the air itself pressing against me in the cabin, as if the room was aware, as if it were waiting. And sometimes, when I wander other ridges or forested paths, I feel the same awareness at the edge of my perception, the same weight of something unseen, something patient, something deliberate. Some places in these mountains, they do not want to be remembered. Blackwater Ridge is one of them. That cabin, real or not, existed long enough to leave its mark on me, and perhaps it exists still somewhere between memory and shadow, waiting for another traveler who is curious enough, stubborn enough, or foolish enough to notice it. I will never know, and perhaps that is the point. The memory is enough, the lingering unease, the subtle impression of being watched. It is enough to remind me that the mountains hold secrets, and some of those secrets have no intention of ever letting themselves be known. Even now, I sometimes dream of the cabin. I see the open door, the metallic smell thick in the air, the chairs perfectly arranged, and I feel that same sense of eyes on me, the quiet patience of a room that knows me as well as I know it. And when I wake, the memory remains, as vivid as the day I first found it, a silent testament to the fact that some places are alive in ways the mind cannot explain, and that some parts of these mountains refuse to be forgotten, no matter how hard we try to hold on to them. Wolf Pine Hollow had always been a place I'd heard whispers about, the kind of place locals in the county avoided without reason, or rather with a reason too subtle for words. The stories spoke of the hollow as being older than memory, a narrow valley carved between two ridges where sunlight barely reached the ground and the mist lingered long after dawn. I was 21 when I first went there alone, checking traps I'd set the previous evening. I woke before sunrise, dressed quickly in worn boots and a flannel shirt, and carried my pack quietly down the old trail that led into the hollow. The air was damp and cold, settling against my face like a living thing, and the mist clung to the creek that ran through the hollow, curling around the rocks and roots in ghostly swirls. At first, everything seemed normal. The creek bubbled faintly. Over mossy stones, the branches shifted slightly in the pre-dawn breeze, and the forest smelled of wet pine and decay. I moved carefully along the bank, checking each trap, pausing to make sure none had been disturbed overnight. My mind wandered briefly to the older hunters' tales, how they said the hollow had a way of keeping things, of watching you, but I dismissed it. I had traps to check, a morning to work, and no time for the superstitions of men who had spent too long listening to the wind. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mist, the way shadows pooled in hollows between trees, but then it shifted. Tall, thin, a dark shape moving against the fog. No sound came from it, not a rustle, not a snapping branch, not the brushing of clothing against bark. It was like it existed in a separate layer of the world, and it moved only when I moved. I froze immediately, the hair on my arms and neck prickling. I had no weapon ready, though instinctively my hands clenched into fists. My eyes tracked the shadow as it mimicked my every step. I took one cautious step forward. It took one too. I stepped back. It stepped back, perfectly in sync. Panic began to rise. My heart thumped so hard I could hear it echo in my own ears. I whispered to myself that it was an animal, a large deer or some feral person playing a trick, but no noise accompanied it, and the shape never solidified. The mist hung thick and wet, obscuring details, but the shadow was clear enough to feel its presence. It was deliberate, patient, studying me. I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't something that would follow me anywhere else. It belonged to the hollow. I ran then, not thinking, just moving, pounding my boots against roots and loose stones. Each step I took, I felt the echo of its movement match mine exactly. I didn't glance back, though I wanted desperately to confirm it wasn't following. My lungs burned, my chest ached, but the fear driving me kept my legs moving faster than I thought possible. The creek's mist swirled around me, cold and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic that made my stomach twist. The forest pressed in on both sides, narrowing the path, and every shadow became a potential hiding place. By the time I reached the road at the edge of the hollow, the sun had risen enough to burn away the mist in patches. The light streamed across the low trees, hitting the creek and the rocks with gold and silver. Relief should have flooded me, but it didn't. I glanced briefly toward the hollow, trying to confirm that the shadow had stayed behind, but I couldn't find it. Not physically, yet in my mind, in that place where memory lingers, it was still there, exact, deliberate, stepping when I stepped, waiting for another day when I might be foolish enough to return. Hunters in the county never talk much about Wolf Pine Hollow, at least not openly. I learned later from an old man at the feed store that the hollow has a reputation. "It keeps things," he said, leaning close over the counter, eyes darting to the window as if expecting the hollow itself to reach through. "Keeps things it doesn't ever release." That stuck with me. It wasn't the shadow itself that scared me, not entirely. It was the knowledge that the hollow had claimed it as part of itself, as it had claimed countless other things before me, things I would never know about. I never set foot in Wolf Pine Hollow again. I avoid the road near it. Even talking about it aloud makes my chest tighten, the memory vivid enough to make the hair on my arms stand on end. I can see the shadow in my mind's eye, as clear now as it was that morning, the way it moved, tall and thin, against the curling mist, and the way it matched my steps perfectly, almost like a cruel, silent teacher demonstrating the rules of the hollow. I remember every detail, the smell of wet pine and iron, the oppressive quiet, the weight of anticipation pressing down on me as if the air itself were alive. Sometimes, on mornings when fog clings to the lower valleys near my home, I feel the same awareness at the edge of my perception, a faint echo of the hollow's patience. I tense instinctively, heart thumping, as if expecting the shadow to emerge and step once more in perfect rhythm with my own. The memory is a shadow itself, following me, a piece of the hollow I carry wherever I go. It is patient, deliberate, and unrelenting. And I know, though I have never returned, that Wolf Pine Hollow waits for anyone who dares to enter, marking them, imprinting them in its quiet, meticulous way, never forgetting, never releasing. Even years later, when I walk other forest paths, the memory surfaces with a subtle insistence. A branch snaps too sharply. A patch of fog clings too low. A shadow stretches across the forest floor just a second longer than it should. My mind flickers to that morning, to the shadow, to the precise mimicry that defied reason. I can't explain it. Rational thought fails. All I know is that I survived, but the hollow claimed part of me the moment it knew I had noticed. A part of me that I cannot shake, that lingers at the edge of perception, in the same way it lingers in the mist. The fear, I felt that morning was not like any fear I have experienced elsewhere. It was quiet, patient, and intimate. It was a knowing, a subtle awareness that the hollow observed me not for its own satisfaction, but because it had the right to, because it had the power to mark me and leave me with the memory of that mark for the rest of my life. The shadow did not chase me in the usual sense, but it held a permanence I cannot escape. I can see it clearly even now, tall, thin, unmoving yet moving, a shape that exists because the hollow wills it to, a teaching, a reminder. I carry the hollow with me in ways I cannot fully articulate. Even far from Wolfpine Hollow, the memory presses against my chest in certain conditions, a mist that seems too thick, a forest path that seems too silent, a shadow that moves oddly in the corner of my vision. I remember the rhythm most of all. It was not random. Every step I took was noted, every pause catalogued, and I know, deep down, that the hollow still remembers, that the shadow waits for the next person who might wander too deeply, too confidently into its domain. There is a lesson embedded in that morning I cannot forget. Some places have memory. Some shadows exist not in spite of the light, but because of it. Some hollows, like Wolfpine, take what they want and release nothing. I survived, but only physically. The hollow owns a part of me, permanent, subtle, impossible to name or touch, yet undeniable. And I will not return. Hunters may joke about ghost tracks or strange sightings, but they know in their bones that the hollow does not forgive curiosity lightly. I carry the memory, precise and unyielding, a rhythm I cannot escape, a shadow I cannot shake, a reminder that the mountains are alive in ways we cannot measure, and they hold their own histories, patient and deliberate, in mist, in shadow, in memory. I first found the cabin late one autumn, on a morning when the air was crisp and the mist hung low over the ridges like a heavy quilt pressed against the mountains. The trail I was following narrowed quickly as I climbed, overgrown with brambles and the remains of fallen trees, and the light of the rising sun barely penetrated the dense canopy. I had been hiking for hours, following a creek I thought might lead somewhere, though I hadn't the faintest idea where. The mountains at that time of year have a quiet patience to them, a stillness that presses in on you, and I felt it deep in my chest, that sense of being observed without knowing by whom or what. Then I saw it. A small cabin tucked behind a thick wall of trees, almost hidden from the path entirely. Smoke rose lazily from a thin chimney, curling into the sky and disappearing into the low fog. A faint glow lit a single window, warm and inviting against the cold gray morning. My heart started to beat faster, though I didn't know why. I had been alone all morning, no other hikers, no sounds of life beyond the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. And yet this cabin felt deliberate, placed there as if for me alone to find. I hesitated at first, scanning the trees around me, noting how the fog pressed against the trunks and the way the light bent oddly through the mist. But curiosity pulled me forward. I walked closer, careful, my boots crunching softly against the dead leaves and broken twigs. The closer I got, the more real the cabin became, the details sharper, the warped wooden boards of the walls, the chipped paint around the window frame, the faint scent of smoke carried on the damp air. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. I could feel my chest tightening, a knot of anticipation and unease that I hadn't felt before. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside, and the smell hit me, a faint odor of damp wood and iron, subtle, metallic, the kind that twists your stomach with a sense of wrongness. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair, placed neatly in the center of the room, facing the wall. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempts at steadiness. "Hello?" Nothing. The air hung heavy and cold as though the cabin itself was holding its breath, listening, waiting. I took a few careful steps around the chair, my eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the corners. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, and yet the weight of attention was unbearable. The chair seemed to hold a presence, a memory, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago, observing, judging, and then vanished. I stayed longer than I should have, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. Every instinct told me to leave, to run down the trail and never look back, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The quiet was deeper than any silence I had known, the kind that presses in from all sides, making you certain that the slightest noise will shatter the world. I touched the chair lightly, noting the worn edges, the splinters in the wood, and the lingering warmth of memory it seemed to carry. Then a faint creak behind me made me spin, though there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the single chair, the smell of iron and damp. Finally, I stepped outside, the cold autumn air rushing to fill the space I had left behind. The fog hung heavy around the cabin, the light in the window fading as the sun rose a little higher, and I turned back to look at it fully. It was gone. The cabin vanished, as though it had never been there, leaving only trees, mist, and the soft murmur of the creek I had followed. My stomach twisted and a chill ran down my spine. I searched the area, circling where the clearing had seemed to be, but there was nothing. No trace of a foundation, no path, nothing but the forest reclaiming its own. Since that day, I have returned every autumn, hoping to find the cabin again, to understand what I saw, to catch even a glimpse of the smoke and the faint window light. I have walked countless miles through that stretch of Widow's Peak, checking every hollow, every clearing, every bend in the creek. Nothing. It never appears, and yet the memory is burned into me, as vivid as the first morning I found it. I can remember the smell of the air inside, the creak of the floorboards, the stillness of the room, the way the chair faced the wall, waiting. I can feel it sometimes in the wind, in the shifting fog that creeps through the ridges in autumn. A reminder that the mountains hold their own memories, and some things are meant to be hidden. I have tried to explain it rationally. Perhaps it was a trick of light and fog, a reflection, a cabin I misremembered in the grip of fatigue and cold. But the memory refuses to be rationalized. I remember every detail too clearly. I remember the way the forest outside held its breath, the way the mist clung to my jacket, the oppressive stillness that followed me down the trail. It is not a story I tell easily, because I know that anyone who hears it will either dismiss it or fear it, and neither reaction captures the precise, deliberate strangeness of what I experienced. Sometimes, when the fog rolls into my own valley, low and heavy, I feel that same tension at the edge of my awareness. A tree seems too perfectly still, a shadow too sharp against the gray morning, a light that might be a reflection or might be something else entirely. And I remember the chair, the smell, the impossibility of the cabin's disappearance, and I feel that same pulse of unease, the one that pressed against me in Widow's Peak. The mountains remember, in ways we cannot measure, and the cabin, if it ever existed in full, remains a secret they refuse to reveal. I have learned to walk differently now, to respect the gaps between trees, the spaces where fog lingers, the places that seem too quiet. The mountains do not forgive curiosity lightly, and Widow's Peak hides what it chooses. I have never returned to the exact spot where I first found the cabin, though each autumn I am drawn to the forest edges, compelled to search once more, hoping for a glimpse, though knowing it will not come. Some things are meant only to be remembered, never found again. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the cabin clearly, the slight sag of the roof, the faint glow of the window, the curl of smoke into the mist. I can smell the damp wood and iron, feel the oppressive stillness, and the memory is as immediate as the day I left it. The mountains hide things for a reason. They preserve their own stories, their own memories, their own quiet judgments. And sometimes, if you are patient enough and foolish enough, you find them, and the experience stays with you forever. A subtle, patient, and persistent reminder that some places are not ours to understand, only to witness and only to remember.